Okay, so our reading today is from Job, chapter 1. It's all right. So Job, chapter 1. Believe it or not, we're actually going to get through the entire book of Job today. It's a light, short book. But Job chapter 1, verses 1 to 12. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the peoples of the east. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular custom. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, who came with them, the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" And Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth in it." And then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord God said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your power. But on the man himself you must not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Right, well, continuing on in our Waiting in Hope series, this is part 5 of that series, and we're going to various parts of the scriptures and looking at how it is that we can take hope in even when things aren't going so well, and why it is that we can take hope. And it's a strange thing, it doesn't make sense at one level, and certainly when we look at the story of Job, it's one of those mysterious books, and I've got to be perfectly honest with you, this is a challenge to preach this passage, and we are actually going to get through the whole book, believe it or not. We're not obviously going to go in detail. I'm just going to give an overview of the message that we have in Job. But before we do that, some years ago, speaking of India as we did before, back in 2009, I went to India this is a few years after I'd had a really nasty car accident there, and I was actually going to give a testimony in the church there who had helped me when I was in hospital. And while during the service, it was a fairly long service, and there was a team at the church from Youth with a Mission. You may have heard of Youth with a Mission, YWAM. And there was all these bright young faces there, just full of joy. It was great. And they had a very near accident in their bus. They were travelling in their bus, actually on their way to do some work in another part of India, and a truck had come round a blind corner, as they do. That's kind of standard issue there. And this truck had come round, and they thought, "This is it, we're all going to die." And then the truck swerved just at the last second. They swerved. They actually slammed on the brakes. They spun. They went a full 360 degrees. And this young man who was giving a testimony says, "Isn't it great when you're serving the Lord, he looks after you?" And then I had to get up and give my testimony of how, we had a ploughed head on into the truck, and everyone died and I was badly injured. How do you put those two things side by side? And it was a really weird situation where they said, God had blessed us, we were on a mission from God, and he kept us safe. And then I had to get up and say, yeah, I was on a mission from God and nearly died, and my youth pastor died and the driver died. How do you handle that? Well, I'll tell you how you do. I've got no clue. To start with, I have to say that. And, the problem of suffering goes against our instinctive spirituality and what I would call the logic of karma. The instinctive spiritual position of everyone on earth heads towards karma. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Problem is, that's not true, is it? People say crime doesn't pay. Well, that's not true. It pays every day. Most criminals get away with everything they do. Did you know that? It's a really good choice of career if you want to make a lot of money. Justice doesn't get done most of the time. That's just the fact. And we know that. We experience that. And reality shows us another hand than the instinctive spiritual idea that we have in our head of karma. A hand that where apparently dumb luck and random circumstance are distributed evenly over all people in all places through all time. And suffering and misfortune fall on both the righteous and the not so righteous, and serendipity and happiness are dispensed without prejudice or partiality on both the good and the bad. And the book of Job is written to speak directly to this conundrum. How do we understand a world in which suffering of all kinds is not only common, but where even the virtuous and the godly seem to suffer as much as many? The existence of suffering in a world created by a good and almighty God is a fundamental theological dilemma, and perhaps the most serious objection to the Christian religion. I think that would be fair enough to say. But here's the mystery. I meet people all the time. There are people in this room right now who have suffered greatly, tragedy, loss, all kinds of things which I won't go into. I'll give one example though. I met a woman who had lost 2 children at different times in her life. And she was one of the most joyous believers I'd ever met. I knew her when she was in her 70s, and there was something about this woman, and I said, what is it about this woman that enables her to believe and to be so full of joy after the tragedies that she suffered? What I come to understand eventually, there was nothing about that woman that was special. There's something special about the God she believes in. And this sort of thing happens to everyday people. Everyday people just like you and me, we all suffer. And how we're going to suffer and how that's going to work out in the long run is not dependent on the specialness of your spirit. It's got everything to do with God. Now, clearly this has been a problem which has had to be dealt with down through the ages, because Job, believe it or not, is considered by many the oldest sophisticated book in the world. So it was written before Genesis, it was written before any other books in the Bible, and there were other writings before this, but this was considered the oldest sophisticated book still in existence. There may have been other books written that have disappeared since then, but so this is a book that dates back to antiquity, and it was dated back to the period before the law of Moses and probably a few generations after Abraham. Job himself, the character Job, we know nothing of. It's most likely that he's actually a fictional character and that the whole book is a rhetorical book. However, it's very likely it was actually based on true events. You know, when you're beginning of a Hollywood movie, it says this movie depicts or is based on true events. Usually that's fairly loosely connected to the true events if you actually know anything about the true events. But it's extremely likely that this book was written to deal with the problem of human suffering and of a good God. And so the story may have been made up, but it may have been based on a real life story of someone who was truly a good man and who suffered greatly. And as we saw right at the beginning, there was this council in heaven. Of course, this is all a rhetorical setup for the story, but God is talking with some of his angelic beings, and Satan, who is an angelic being by the way, just on the side, he presents himself to God, and God says, what have you been up to? He said, I've been going backwards and forwards in the earth. And he said, yeah, well, while you were there, did you happen to notice my servant Job? He's like my bestie. And then, of course, Satan challenges God and says, yeah, well, sure, he's your best mate, because look what you do for him. You bless him. Everything he does is perfectly worked out. Why would he ever doubt you? But I'll tell you what, you let me take everything from him and see how long he still loves you after that. Does Job fear God for nothing? He challenges God with. And so God says, all right then, let's see how this goes. You can take away everything he owns. And then he goes on to say in chapter 1, verse 13 through to verse 22, just in those few short verses, Satan strikes everything that Job has, and he loses all of his servants, all of his property, his house, and worst of all of his children die in a horrible accident. But Job is unmoved. He retains his faith. He says that, shall we not accept both good and bad from the Lord? And he is unmoved. And so in chapter 2, Satan goes back to God and says, well, okay, I took everything he owns, but he's still got his health. You know what they say, if you haven't got your health, you haven't got anything. And he says, let me take his health away and let's see how long he still loves you then. And so God allows him permission to take away his health. So in Job chapter 2, verse 7, it says, so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. And his wife came to him and said, are you still maintaining your integrity? Why not curse God and die? And he replied, you're thinking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Now that's the setup for the story. That's just all kind of the background setup for the real story. And the real story that is being addressed is the question of, why do good people suffer? And then we go into the main part of the story, where in chapter 2, Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about the troubles that had come upon Job, and they set out from their homes, and they met together by agreement to go and sympathise with him and comfort him. And when they saw him, this is chapter 2, verse 12, when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognise him, and they began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. And they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. So, I mean, these are true friends. They've come to comfort, and they're sitting with him. And then in chapter 3, it says, and after this, Job opened his mouth and he cursed the day he was born. He said, may the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, a boy is conceived, that day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. So, he's suffering. He's experiencing it. He's feeling it. He wishes he was never born. And then in the whole of the rest of chapter 3 is Job's lament. And if you ever need some material for helping you with lament, then Job's the place to go. He knows how to do it, and he'd do it really well. I mean, the fact that the book of Job has stood the test of time, it's still relevant today. It's still meaningful and still beautiful, really. It's powerfully written, beautifully written. And, I won't go into all of the details of his lament. Suffice to say that it's pretty profound. Now, the key to understanding what takes place after this is that each of Job's friends then want to reply to Job and give some reasoning as to why he's suffering. And so each of them in turn, starting with Eliphaz and then Bildad and then Zophar, the three of them come and take their turns to try to explain to Job why he's suffering. And this is really the big picture of Job, because what we'll see here is a comparative observation of certain theologies and wisdoms that were available in the ancient world at that time. And so what we're going to see is there's going to be the theology of the Edomites, and there's going to be the theology of the Babylonians, and then the theology of the Canaanites is going to be brought forward. Now we're going to do something like that very soon here in church, aren't we, Rhonda? We're going to have a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Hindu, and myself are going to give our perceptions and the differences, and show that, compare and contrast the differences between what we believe about death and what happens after death. And naturally, I want people to hear that. Why wouldn't I? I think we got the greatest hope there is. But anyway, we have this comparative theology going on here between these religions as they bring forward their particular wisdoms. And it's a little bit like that time, don't you have ever heard of that time when there was a Muslim cleric, a Jewish rabbi, and a Buddhist monk, and a Christian bishop, and they all went into a pub, and the publican just looked up and said, "What is this, some sort of joke?" Okay. I admit that's not that funny. But we start with Eliphaz, the Temanite. Now Eliphaz means, look, as a general rule too, by the way, if you're ever reading Jewish texts, particularly Old Testament texts, and you want to get a deeper understanding of what's going on, one of the keys to understanding Jewish writing is to understand the meanings of the names in the stories. In the West, we just name people whatever we name them. I name my kids Tate, Tess, Jack and Max, all one-syllable names, so that it could go with a really complicated name like Kowalik. Otherwise they'd spend the rest of their life having to write an essay every time they sign their name. So, but it was essentially meaningless, really. But in Jewish speak, and particularly in the Old Testament, names mean something. And given that this is a rhetorical story, then the names are deliberately chosen and full of meaning and full of substance. And now the name Eliphaz is the name also used of Esau's first son. And Teman was Esau's grandson. So what he's saying is, and what he's telling us in the story, is that Eliphaz is an Edomite. Now, an Edomite, Edom, is where modern-day Petra is. And it's a little bit down to the south east of where Jordan is today, but it's in the southeast of where Israel was, and that's where the descendants of Esau went and lived. And if you know anything about ancient history, you'll know that there's always been this kind of jealousy and what would you call it, rivalry that's been going on between the descendants of Israel and the descendants of Jacob, Israel, and the descendants of Esau. And it even came down to, did you know that Herod is a descendant of Esau? And he tried to kill the greatest descendant of Israel, Jesus. And that kind of long rivalry has been going on. It's part of the background of biblical history, which you have to understand to understand kind of what's going on here. But this Edomite is coming, and he's giving his take on things. And Eliphaz, of all of them in the book of Job, represents the most basic and pragmatic and the most simplistic of the contemporary theologies at the time. Basically, he had what we just call that straightforward karma kind of situation. If you be good, good things will happen. If you be bad, bad things will happen. It's the most rudimentary form of religious philosophy or religious theology. But as I heard it once said, every complex problem has a solution which is simple, direct, and plausible. The problem is, the answer that is given that way is always wrong. It seems right. It seems good. But it's always wrong in the end. Basically what Eliphaz puts forward is somewhere in your youth or childhood you must have done something good or bad. You know, the old Sound of Music. I have issues with the Sound of Music, by the way. My parents made me watch it over and over again. I can't stand the thought of it now, but people tell me it's a good movie. And so I've got all those songs that etched into my head. And somewhere in my youth or childhood I must have done something good or bad. That's the most basic form of theology there is. It's, karma. And so what Eliphaz says to Job is, well, what you need to do is discover what you did wrong when you were a child. Maybe you've forgotten what you did, but if you really think about it and you go back into the past, you'll discover that there's a reason why you're suffering, and the suffering is your own making. Anyway, Job replies to him and says, I've done nothing wrong, and he protests his innocence at length and really puts down this idea from Eliphaz. And then Bildad steps into the picture in chapter 8. Now, Bildad means something like Bel has love. That's what his name means. Bel has love. Bel is the Babylonian name for God, a shortened version of Baal, meaning Lord. And Bildad does not refute what Eliphaz has said before him, but he nuances his response with a somewhat deeper wisdom. So he's bringing the wisdom of the Babylonians and the Babylonian religion to the table here. And he points out that God is always just and right. You see, there's always some truth to what is said. Every religion has truth in it. And every philosophy, of course, any philosophy that's worth its time to repeat, has something in it which is good and true and noble. And that's certainly what this Bildad is doing here. He's nuancing his response with a deeper wisdom. And he points out how it may not be just pure karma, but maybe he's meant to learn a lesson. If he learns a lesson through his suffering, maybe he'll grow in wisdom, and then he'll put that wisdom into place, and then his suffering will end. Maybe if he was more devoted and more earnest in his worship, he would get a good reply. For instance, in chapter 8, verse 2, he says, "How long will you say such things? Your words are like a blustering wind. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. But if you seek God earnestly and plead with the Almighty, if you be pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore to you your prosperous state." Now, what's he really saying there? What he's saying is you can trade your way out of this problem. You can trade your way out of this problem with devotion. If you be devoted, pray harder, make better sacrifices, then God will bless you and you'll be fine. But again, Job protests his innocence and said he has nothing to apologise for. And he even accuses God of injustice and callousness. In chapter 10, verses 2 to 7. I won't go into all of that. Then we get the third character. We have Zophar. Now, Zophar means something like a sentinel, like a shrieking bird alerting to danger. Now, I was just out the front of church here the other day with Jan Lyons, and we heard all the birds all freaking out. All the honey eaters were suddenly calling. And of course, being good bird watchers, we start scanning the sky, looking for a falcon, and then a falcon just flew straight over the top here, a little hobby. And you remember that? Yeah. And so what Zophar, Zophar, his name is something like he's sounding a warning from God. Other than that, we really don't know much about him, where he was born, what his place was, or what his religion really was. And there are some echoes of a Babylonian wisdom here behind some of the things he's saying. More than that, we cannot say. A lot of this stuff has been lost in the mist of time. But nonetheless, he adds another level of wisdom to the conversation. And he joins the argument, and he argues that there must be some secret sin that has caused this calamity. In chapter 11, verse 13, he says, "Yet if you devote your heart to him and stretch out your hands to him, if you put away the sin that is in your hand and allow no evil to dwell in your tent, then free of fault you will lift up your face and you will stand firm and without fear. You will surely forget your trouble, recalling it only as waters gone by. Life will be brighter than noonday, and darkness will become like morning. And you'll be secure because there is hope, and you will look about you and you'll take rest in safety. You will lie down and no one will make you afraid, and many will court your favour. But the eyes of the wicked fail, and escape will elude them. Their hope will become a dying gasp." But again, even in the strength of this, Job points out that there are plenty of worse people than him who nevertheless go about without a worry in the world. In chapter 12, verse 6, he says, "The tents of marauders are undisturbed, and those who provoke God are secure." So he's refuting his wisdom and saying, well, if that's true, how come the murderers get away with murder? That doesn't make any sense at all. So then Job goes as far as to say that he's so sure of his innocence that he will boldly enter God's courtroom and make a case to prove himself to be more righteous than God. Can you believe it? In this passage is the most famous verse in the book, which is generally misquoted and misunderstood, and that is verse 15. He says, this is where Job says, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." How many people know that verse? Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. He's told positively. It's told as if Job is saying, no matter what, I'm going to believe in God. But in actual fact, if you look at the context and understand it more deeply, what he's saying is, even if God should put me to death for sins I've never committed, I will still put my hope in him, proving myself to be more righteous than God. It's the height of arrogance. But here's the thing, I've never met a person who hasn't thought that. We may not say it out loud, but we do it with our actions. We say, how come I'm suffering? This is not right. God, you're wrong. You've messed up. Even down to as little thing like we go outside and say, what a horrible day. You know what you're really saying? God, you're not controlling the meteorological circumstances of my life very well. Now, look, we all do this. I get it. You know, we're seeing things from a particular point of view and all that. Nevertheless, just be aware that our complaints all end up landing on the desk of God at some point. Eventually, he has to read that mail. So you know, Job is really hanging on to. He's saying, "I'm right, God's wrong, and you're all wrong as well." And then a new character steps in, a young man. He wasn't part of the original three, but this is a young man, a new character in the frame of a man called Elihu. And unlike the three friends, Elihu is wiser and more sophisticated than they are. He is younger than the others, representing the latest and greatest insights. So he may not, you know, in this rhetorical story, what he is bringing to the table is, you know, the latest and greatest theology. And his name is a derivative of a Canaanite god and means something like God is my Lord. And he rebukes Job for being so presumptuous in his accusations of God. And he's right. His rebukes of Job are right. And much of what he says is, when you read it, is perfectly right and good. You could take big chunks of what Elihu says and apply it to your life and it would work. The wisdom is almost faultless. But here's the thing. You know, you can get through life and if you've understood Newtonian physics, for instance, I never understood any physics, but people tell me that Newtonian physics is logical, it makes sense, it's kind of linear and it works. And at a level it does. I mean, you know, I pick this book up and drop it and Newtonian physics explains that perfectly. And at a certain level, it's great. It's right and true and good. But once you get beyond the gravitational field of the Earth, or you approach the speed of light, or you go into get somewhere near a black hole, Newtonian physics doesn't explain anything. You need a deeper form of physics. You need quantum physics. And there may even be other physics out there we know nothing of. Some scientists actually speculate that there's something like 16 dimensions, of which we're only aware of about 6, and we live in 4. So, yeah, anyway, it's fun to think about these things, but I haven't got the first clue about them. But what we can say is, just because something works at one level doesn't mean it works everywhere. And what Elihu is bringing to the table is the best of human wisdom, the best of human theology. And then, cutting right across this whole thing, in chapter 38, verse 1, then God speaks. And the Lord spoke to Jacob out of the storm. I love the way it introduces God comes in a storm. And out of the storm, God speaks. And this is what he says. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. I love the way it's put, this same passage is put in the Message in chapter 40, verse 1. God then confronted Job directly. Now, what do you have to say for yourself? Are you going to haul me, the mighty one, into court and press charges? And then Job answers, well, I'm speechless, I'm in awe, words fail me. I should never have opened my mouth. I've talked too much, way too much. I'm ready to shut up and listen. And finally, Job gets it. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know until we know that we know nothing. And that's the point that Job finally comes to. And God's rejoinder is that God is God, and he answers to nobody. He cannot be controlled or compelled to answer. His knowledge is too much and too wonderful for that. In other words, the subject of true theology is not you or me. It's not my devotion that controls God. It's not my prayers that control God. It's God who controls my prayers and controls my devotion. And in the words of C.S. Lewis, he said, the spectacle of the universe, as revealed by experience, can never have been the ground of religion. In other words, what you can see and observe around you and the deductions that you can make cannot be the basis of truth. Because then the centre of all truth is in you. But he goes on and says, it must always have been something in spite of which religion acquired from a different source. In other words, true religion, true faith has to be based outside of yourself and in the person of God himself. And the only way you can know the truth about God is if he makes himself known to you. And add deductions about God, even the very best of human theology, even Elihu's wisdom and the wisdom of this world in its contemporary form as well, cannot explain the things that are unexplainable. And the only way you can ever come to know the truth is to know that you can't know the truth, and then you can start to know the truth. Because the truth then may reveal itself to you rather than you coming and getting it and knowing it for yourself. So true faith is based not in human experience or human wisdom. Truth comes from a different source, which exists regardless of our knowledge of it. The love of God cannot be contained by our goodness, nor can love for God be based on anything so small as luck or good circumstance or theological wisdom. God is God above all reason or insight, and everything that we can know of him is entirely contingent upon him. In the meantime, we may suffer. But suffering is not meaningless. It may seem meaningless at a purely human level if we make ourselves the centre of this and the subject of that meaning, then it will never make sense to us. But suffering does not play to the tune of human logic. All the theologies and philosophies of human origin are like wooden yardsticks used to measure interstellar space when it comes to understanding suffering. What we can say is that suffering matters to God. He notices your suffering. And it's part of something much bigger and more profound than we can immediately understand. And let me finish with the Apostle Paul, who sums it up nicely in the book of Romans, when he says in Romans 8 verse 28, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So I go back to that woman I met who had suffered terrible tragedies, and yet she was full of love for God. She knew something that most people don't know. She knew that God understands suffering, and that one day vindication will take place, and that it will all come together in the end. And again, I quote Paul, and he says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glories that will be revealed in us. And somehow or another, suffering is woven into that fabric of that. We cannot come to that glory without suffering. Suffering is necessary. I don't know why, I don't know how, I can't explain it. All I can say is that somehow in the tapestry of human life and the plans of God, suffering is part of it. Even Jesus suffered. He became one of us, and he suffered just like us. He wasn't hovering above suffering. He went through it, and he came out the other side, and he blazed a path. And it says, for the glory that was set before him, he endured the pain of the cross. And I say, if you can see the glory, if you can see the big plan and see that God has got this, that somehow the suffering that you personally are going through is taking you somewhere, and everything is working together for good. Not everything is good. I don't even think everything happens for a reason, but God makes everything work together for his purposes in the end. And I know that might sound a little bit unsatisfying at one level, but I don't know any other answer to this other than God is good. Amen.